So I am mixing up some colours for the background. I'm starting off with phthalo blue and some yellow ochre. Big puddle, big backgrounds, big puddles. A little bit more of phthalo blue with the yellow ochre and some Paynes grey. I'm actually mixing up some sap green here, and I'm going to add a little bit of magenta. I'm also mixing up a big puddle of cerulean blue, and I'm going to mix up some cerulean with the yellow ochre as well. So make sure you mix up plenty of paint. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to use an oil pastel, and I'm actually going to draw on to the paper, as you can see here. Quite random marks. This will resist the watercolour and create some lovely light greens in the background. So I'm using a large round brush and I'm applying the colours wet on dry here. I'm working in sections, so this is the kind of top left section, and I've divided it with a line from the oil pastel to the left there. I'm just working my way carefully around these beautiful lilies and the leaves. So I'm just taking my time here, loading the brush and varying the colours. You want the consistency to be sort of quite watery at this sort of stage, and I'm going to add thicker paint, damp into damp, to really bring out the light of the flowers around the edges. So I'm just working my way carefully in to the shape of the flower here. This is the negative space. The positive shapes are the flowers and the leaves. The negative shapes and spaces are the background. I'm mixing up here a little bit of Viridian and phthalo blue, slightly creamier, and I'm painting damp into wet, so the paint isn't as wet as the surface. I'm spattering with water to create light effects, and I'm using some Brusho to sprinkle onto the wet surface there. It creates some lovely colours and textured effects. I'm using my Twig to sort of maneuver the paint around, especially in really sort of small areas. It really gets you the detail. You just pull the paint with the Twig. It's just a twig from the garden sharpened with a pencil sharpener. And I'm also using it to scratch into the surface of the paper to create really thin lines. The watercolour paint runs into the scratch. It is permanent, and you may not want to do this. You can actually paint thin lines later, wet on dry. So I'm working on the next section. Instead of starting off wet on dry, I'm using my large flat 1-inch brush to wet the surface first. I'm being very careful to paint around the leaves and the petals. If you wet the leaves and the petals, the paint will run onto it. So as long as you keep them dry, you have the control. So it makes it easier to work in sections, especially if you've got a large background. And I want to spend time sort of creating different sort of textures, using different techniques, etc. So I'm using those colours that I mixed at the beginning, and I'm painting them now wet into wet with my size 10 round brush. And again, I'm tilting to get the paint moving and blending and adding a little bit more yellow there to create some variety of colours. Loading my brush there, painting a little bit of the green, sort of blue green there, wet into wet, carefully painting around the petals and the leaves. So I'm using the Twig again just to finesse those sort of tricky areas there, but I'm also adding paint, creamy paint there with the Twig to create a darker outline to bring out those light petals. And I'm using the Twig again to scratch into the surface of the paper to create some random sort of linear effects for the background. I'm using a watercolour pencil here, and I'm going to rub it against some sandpaper, and the pigment will fall onto the wet paper, creating some lovely textures here as well. It's a fun technique to do this, but also to use the watercolour pencil on the wet paper to create marks there, similar to the Twig, but this time you're not actually scratching the surface of the paper. I'm using the oil pastel now on the wet surface to create colour and texture. If you don't have any of these materials, I will give you alternatives. This you can apply green watercolour paint later on. And for the Brusho and the watercolour pencil, you can use spattering techniques. So I am mixing up a little bit more green here with the phthalo blue, and I'm painting this creamier paint damp into wet here, again to have that dark colour bring out the light petals here. And I'm tilting to allow the paint to flow away as well, and teasing it with a very wet brush. I've decided to use a pipette to get that paint moving even more. So I am working my way down now to the bottom left hand corner, adding a little bit of dark and varying my colours here and there. I've swapped to my size 8 round brush. You notice I really do collect lots of paint on my brush. I'm painting with puddles. This will actually give you more time. If you find your watercolours are drying very quickly, it might be because you're applying the paint too dry. So not enough water, not enough paint. So I'm using the twig again here just to finesse. And I'm going to carry on now working my way around the lily here, bottom left. So you can see the painting is taking shape here. And I haven't actually touched the lilies or the leaves. I've just painted around them very carefully. And it just really, that dark colour really does bring them to life, and you can really explore interesting sort of textures and backgrounds this way. I've kept the colours quite harmonious, yellows, greens, blues, and just keeping it really sort of pretty, not overdoing the techniques, but just applying the darks here, the very small dark negative spaces here, wet on dry, and again using the twig to really finesse the very small intricate areas. You could use a small round brush to do this as well. Take your time, try to sort of breathe when you're painting as well. It's very easy to hold your breath and get a little bit tight. So I'm taking my time painting these very small intricate areas. And I'm just sprinkling a little bit of salt onto the damp surface, and that will create light textures once dried. So I'm wetting the right hand side here, being careful not to touch the flowers and leaves. I've actually mixed up some ultramarine, very dilute, and a little bit of yellow, and I'm painting it wet in wet with my size 10 round brush, varying the colours, adding a little bit more yellow or perhaps a little bit more blue so that it's not one flat colour. And I've just added a touch more dark there, bottom right hand corner, mixing up some green here with Paynes grey as well, slightly creamier, and dropping that damp into wet closest to the flowers. When I get to the leaves, I try and leave the background colour a little bit lighter and don't go in with damp dark paint, but just varying it, adding some cerulean here as well, and carefully painting around the flower here using the tip of my brush, tilting here as well. I've got the puddle running down. You can see there's lots of gorgeous granulation made by the ultramarine. I'm also using the watercolour pencil again and the Brusho to create texture, and I've also decided to sprinkle some salt as well onto the damp surface. So working my way to the top right hand corner here, wetting the background carefully with my size 10 brush, painting some yellow there, wet in wet top right hand corner, and then a little bit of the phthalo blue with the Paynes grey here, quite thick and creamy around the bud there as it sort of runs into the wet in wet, and I'm tilting to allow the paint to move, creating some really gorgeous effects, adding yellow as well, wet into wet. Remember, you can use your own colours. You could have violet and pinky background and just get creative with all the different techniques as well, and just enjoy it. What's great about this way of painting the background first is that you've got the structure of the leaves and the lilies, and you can just really let go in this background here, working in sections, working your way around. You noticed I've actually turned my painting sideways so I can really access the small sort of detailed areas here using ultramarine on its own. It's quite a beautiful colour. I wanted that lovely blue and the yellows to come through this side, almost the lights coming from the top right, streaming its way through, adding a little bit of green here and tilting, just seeing what happens, using the Twig again to scratch into the surface, but you could use the watercolour pencil if you wanted to, or even both. I'm using the watercolour pencil and the sandpaper, and again the Brusho. I'm going to allow my painting to dry naturally so the salt will work, and look how well that salt has worked. It looks stunning. I brushed the salt off and I'm ready to paint the flowers and leaves. So I'm going to paint the shadows for the flowers first. I'm using ultramarine and burnt sienna. I've mixed them up and I've really diluted them. And it's probably 60% ultramarine and 40% burnt sienna. I'm painting wet on dry with my size 8 brush. If you notice, I sort of painted the darkest area first, and now I'm diluting by pushing the water down to that darkest part there, so I don't get any hard edges. I'm just dropping a very dilute ultramarine in there just to cool down the colour. So I'm going to carry on painting the shadows. Now, some of you may find this a little bit daunting. Just take your time, work one petal by one petal. Just make sure you keep more white, almost exaggerate the white, because that way it will look like white lilies. You can get so carried away with the shadow colours that will end up being a grey lily. So remember, with the shadow colours, less is more. So I start off with that sort of very kind of neutral dilute colour, 60% ultramarine and 40% burnt sienna. And I paint it wet on dry is what I'm doing here, and then dilute it and blend and soften with a clean damp brush, and then add a little bit of cool ultramarine in the darkest corner. So again, starting off wet on dry with the ultramarine and burnt sienna dilute mix with my size 8 brush, rinse my brush, and then just soften and dilute. Doing the same here with the markings. Now I'm using a very sort of light yellow with a pinch of ultramarine. So it's a really light yellow green, again wet on dry. A little bit more yellow just at the bottom of the bud there, rinsing my brush and blending and diluting. And what that does, it creates lighter values, but it also creates softer edges. So I have dried my painting and I'm building up a little bit of darks and details on the petals, using the same colour but not as watered down. And again blending and softening. So I'm mixing up some yellow and viridian. You can use a blue as well. It's a big puddle of a light green. I'm mixing up some ultramarine and quinacridone gold. You could use the yellow as well. And I'm painting the leaves, starting off with the light green, wet on dry with my size 10 round brush. So just painting any of the green that I can see here in the photo, just once. And I'm also painting a very light yellow wash in the centre of the lilies there, wet on dry. So I'm adding the darker green now, damp into damp, over the top of that light green wash. You may want to, on the larger leaves, leave gaps so that the light underpainting comes through. As you can see, I'm using my size 8 round brush and using sort of almost like a stripy effect, which the leaves look like. They're quite sort of distinctive. But with the smaller leaves, don't pay too much attention. Just paint them a little bit more silhouette, as I'm doing here, so they don't come forward too much. You've got those 3 main larger leaves that you want to create a little bit more contrast with. The ones that are smaller and in the background sort of pay less attention to. So I'm mixing up here a little bit more of the ultramarine, slightly thicker, with a pinch of the yellow, and just adding damp into damp, a little bit more dark on the main leaves. And I'm going to allow the painting to dry. Once the painting is dry, I'm going to paint the stamen, and I'm mixing up red and yellow to begin with. And I'm painting with my size 2 round brush, wet on dry. And you can see immediately how it brings the flowers to life. So these are the details. So you almost want to sort of work with these large washes in the background, the shadows on the flowers, and then painting in those larger leaves, then start painting in those details. And I've just added some burnt sienna to that red and yellow, slightly creamier, painting a touch of sort of dark on the right hand side, and then blending, as you can see I'm doing here, with a clean damp brush. I'm going to do the same with the stamen, with the lilies on the right, bottom right here, starting off with that orange colour, wet on dry, and then adding the burnt sienna with the red and yellow just to the right hand side, just here and there, and again just softening and blending with a clean damp brush. To make your brush damp, just wipe the brush on a paper towel and take the excess water off. So I'm just adding wet on dry, a touch more of the green here and there in the centres. I've also decided to spatter a little bit over the stamen with that orange to create texture and colour. So I'm adding some more little bits of darks and details on the bud here using the ultramarine with a pinch of yellow. And I've added a little blob of yellow just at the top there. I felt that dark was too strong and coming forward. So I've mixed up the ultramarine and the burnt sienna again, diluted it, and I'm painting some marks here on the petals, wet on dry with my size 2 brush, just to build up some of the details on the petals. Don't make it too dark. I'm adding a little bit of dark here and then blending with a clean damp brush as a bit of a cast shadow, and just sort of adding that. It just sort of brings the flowers to life by sort of adding these extra bits of details where it's slightly darker than those shadows I painted previously. Remember, less is more. We're just trying to describe the petals without overpainting and losing the white and light. So I'm just adding a bit more dark in the center here. You can use a dark green or you can use the ultramarine and burnt sienna. So I'm adding a touch more sort of shadows here and there with the size 2 brush, just to really emphasize some of the main petals and also the centers. So this petal here, I just wanted to add a touch more information, wet on dry, rinse my brush, and then just blend and soften. Watercolours do dry lighter and sometimes too light, so I just wanted to darken this area here. It's the kind of star of the show, this lily. So using the ultramarine and burnt sienna, and again softening at the top of that shadow. And adding a little bit of light green in the centre here, just to really give a bit more colour to the centre of the flowers. A touch more detail now on the bud as well, just sort of defining the marks there with ultramarine with a pinch of yellow to make a sort of darkish green, adding a little bit more of yellow at the top, wet into wet there. Adding a little bit more of that dark green to the underside of the bud here, blending with a clean damp brush, doing the same towards the bottom there, just to build up the shadows. Adding a little bit more shadow to the underside of this petal here, and then adding wet on dry some darks and details on the leaves here, using my size 2 round brush, a mixture of the ultramarine and the quinacridone gold, but you could use yellow. It's about 70% ultramarine and 30% yellow. I felt this lily to the left, bottom left here, just didn't look colourful enough. This is a bit of artistic licence, and I've added some orange and some shadows to the stamen, and I'm going to allow my painting to dry once more. I want to bring out the white lilies a little bit more, especially the star of the show, the top centre lily. So I have mixed up here ultramarine on its own and ultramarine with quinacridone gold, and I am painting wet on dry around the sort of top centre lily here carefully with my size 10 round brush. Really make sure you put plenty of paint on here, because sometimes it could dry and it's very difficult then to soften the outside edge, which is what I'm doing here with a clean wet brush, just to soften and blend. So you've got this soft dark shadow here which really brings out the lily. Brings it forward away from that background. I'm just dropping in a little bit of that ultramarine just right next to the petals there to really sort of sharpen up those darks, painting wet into wet. And to avoid any hard outside edges here, I'm just using clean water to soften the outside edge there, to blend it into the background seamlessly. And I'm doing the same with the bud to bring the bud forward, painting around the bud and then blending with a clean wet brush. So I'm working my way down here to the bottom right lily, painting in the darks, really sort of bringing out those negative shapes. The other thing I'm doing is I'm actually glazing over some of the petals in the lilies behind this lily on the right. And it's to push it back so it doesn't come forward, so the lily on the right comes forward. It makes it look more 3D. So just glaze the lily, and then I'm lifting off with my paper towel some of the paint so it looks like dappled light on the lily behind. And I'm doing the same with this lily in the centre that's behind, just glazing with a very thin wash to push it back, to make it look like it's in shadow as well. So just painting very carefully with the tip of my brush around the stamen here, using the ultramarine with the quinacridone gold. I'm just turning my painting to the side just to do the last bit of darks in the background, wet on dry, carefully painting around this lily, and then using a wet brush just to blend, dilute to the outside edge so I don't lose any of that lovely textured background I painted at the first stage. So I remove the washi tape, and here's a close-up of my lilies with the background. I really hope you've enjoyed this tutorial talking about painting negative shapes, the background, to bring out the positive shapes, your stars of the show. If you'd like to support the work that I create here on YouTube, why not think about joining my Patreon membership? You will get access to exclusive weekly tutorials and extended tutorials, and also downloadable outline sketches, and you can cancel anytime. Details about the membership can be found in the description below. Thank you so much for watching. Happy painting. Bye for now.